So this week for basketball, we're starting off with a chapter from Khan on women's basketball. And this is a really interesting chapter that lays out kind of two important points. One is that women's basketball is a way to see one example of how notions of femininity and masculinity were changing and how deliberate the efforts were by groups of people to change notions of femininity and masculinity, that groups were really trying to convince people that playing in a certain way affected their gender identity, how manly it was to play basketball in a certain way versus how playing basketball in a different way would make it a safe space for femininity, right? And the real success of women's basketball, opening up with that anecdote about basketball in Iowa, intercollegiate competitions, and also working class leagues as places where there were lots of people watching women's basketball and paying to watch women's basketball, bundled with other things like beauty pageants and kind of sex being one of the central selling points of women's sexuality, being something to draw people in to the spectacle of the sport itself, and kind of the ways that Khan is trying to do justice to women reformers who had problems with that, right? So the NSWA is this group of physical educators, women, who consider it very important to reform and really battle for changes in basketball that would make that sport more suitable for their definition of kind of middle-class white femininity. And Khan does something really great in terms of pointing to the hypocrisy that a lot of these very same women who were part of these reform groups exhibited when they played lacrosse, doing the same kinds of things that they said were unladylike in basketball, but just in a different sport that was associated with a more of an elite sensibility. So Khan, as she does throughout her book, is pointing to some contradictions there, and how physical educators trying to reform the game, in some ways, were really working on control over working class women and control over notions of femininity and womanhood. Then, as I said, Khan takes some time here to really try and take the NSWA seriously as a group of women who did really believe in the moral righteousness of their cause and the importance of their cause as a way to shape women's sport in kind of the right way. So pay attention throughout the Khan reading on what kinds of contradictions she points to, what specific instances of changes in basketball being feminine or masculine, where those happen, how those happen. Make sure you understand those. And then we really shift gears with Radar in a chapter that isn't really explicitly about basketball, but has some stuff on the NBA in it, which is television or sports in the professional sports in the television age. And something that I want to point you to is where Radar talks about the other competing leisure practices, and that anecdote of the guy saying, I have a boat, I have a car, I can do all these other things. Why would I sacrifice those leisure options just to go watch a sport in a crowded stadium? And it's where television really plays an important role in transforming professional sports. And the Sports Broadcasting Act is really interesting because it gives you a little bit of a history on something you've probably always been curious about, which are media blackouts. Times when maybe you've wanted to watch the Lions, but it doesn't sell out, so the broadcast is blacked out in the area. These issues have to do with the rights around broadcasting, who gets to sell those rights as an organizing body versus individual teams, and how that impacts access to a broadcast. So make sure you pay attention to where Radar is talking about the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 and how it comes about. And also a great chapter to understand the NFL and how it's really a product of the mid-1950s, its merger with the AFL, the National League, and the American Conference, I should say, which are now the NFC and the AFC, and how an effort to package one set of broadcasting rights gives the NFL as a league first institution the kinds of money and exposure to organize what they kind of jokingly call a bunch of Republicans who manage the league in a socialist way. And it all has to do with the ability to market and sell a spectacle with a very explicit emphasis on the televisability of that spectacle, that sports spectacle, that shapes how the NFL is actually going to structure the sport and the concerns with parity that they have to this day. But then getting back to basketball, we get into the NBA, which we really see, especially in terms of TV contract, was a league that was small fries compared to the expansion of the NFL, for example. But there are key moments which Rader identifies really around the mid-1980s and the emergence of Michael Jordan as a sports superstar that enable some of the transformations in the NBA and how the NBA envisions its demographic as the kind of branding that they want to put into effect to make it more than a game. So pay attention to what Rader's talking about with basketball, but also kind of the general trends he's pointing to in television with other leagues like the NFL. Let's take a look at the schedule page and the writing prompt. It's really two separate questions. How did basketball play a role in the changing notions of femininity and masculinity? So for that question, you should be drawing on Kahn. And what factors influenced the growth of the NBA and the way professional basketball was marketed after the 1980s? So that's where you're going to be using Rader. Make sure you're including plenty of details and specificity on your responses, but really I'm looking for you to identify key shifts. So the question is about growth and change. So tell me how things go from one place to another.